Stand here with me. It's past midnight in a palace that no longer exists. The candles have been snuffed out hours ago. The only light comes from the moon through windows too tall to be warm. And on these walls, portraits, dozens of them, women in jewels, women in silk, women whose names were once whispered in treaty rooms across Europe. Most of them you've never heard of. Here's what they don't tell you about royal blood. It was never a shield, it was currency, and when the throne needed to spend it, it did. We're taught to imagine nobility as gilded safety, but these women, daughters of kings, sisters of emperors, they weren't protected by their birth. They were useful because of it. Assets, leverage, solutions to problems that had nothing to do with them. This isn't a story about monsters. It's about a system that decided, long before any girl was born, exactly how expendable she could become. How many daughters can you name? Now ask yourself, how many were deliberately forgotten?
Let's start with what marriage actually was. Not love, not partnership. A treaty signed in flesh and blood. When a European dynasty needed an alliance, military support, trade access, neutrality in a brewing war, they didn't send diplomats first. They sent a daughter. She would be negotiated for months, her dowry calculated down to the last tapestry, her fertility discussed by men she'd never met. And when the ink dried on the marriage contract, she would leave, often forever, to a kingdom where she didn't speak the language, to a husband she'd seen maybe once in a portrait that lied. But here's the part they don't put in the history books. What happened when that alliance stopped mattering? Picture this. You're a noblewoman in a foreign court. The letters from home used to come every few weeks. Your brother's campaigns, your father's health, small reassurances that you still belonged to something. Then the letters slow down. 1 month, 2 months. Your own ambassadors, the ones who were supposed to speak for you, stop attending court. They're recalled without explanation, no replacement sent. And you start to understand, in a way that sits cold in your stomach, that the alliance your marriage bought is over. Maybe your father lost a war. Maybe a new treaty was signed with his enemies. Maybe he just died, and your brother decided the old partnerships don't serve him anymore. It doesn't matter why. What matters is this. You are still here, in a court that no longer needs you, married to a man whose kingdom now sees yours as irrelevant, or worse, hostile. And here's the cruelest part. You can't go home. Medieval and early modern marriage law was explicit about this. A noblewoman, once married, belonged to her husband's household. Her father's court had no legal obligation to take her back, even if they wanted to, and often they didn't. It would mean admitting the marriage failed, admitting the alliance was a miscalculation. Crowns don't admit mistakes. They bury them. So, you stay, politically obsolete, a reminder of a deal that's no longer useful. In some courts, you'd be stripped of your household, the servants who came with you, sent away, the income promised in your marriage contract, delayed, reduced, stopped entirely. You'd be moved to smaller apartments, farther from the center of power, farther from anyone who remembered why you mattered. And if anything went wrong, if the court faced a scandal, if your husband needed to remarry for a better alliance, if war broke out between your birth family and your married one, the blame would fall on you. Not on the kings who arranged it, not on the diplomats who miscalculated, on you. Because here's what they understood, even if they never said it out loud. A failed alliance needed a face, a scapegoat. And it was always easier to blame the foreign woman than the crown that sent her. She was barren, that's why the treaty fell apart. She was disloyal. That's why her family abandoned her. She was unworthy. That's why no one came for her. The story would be rewritten, and she would be stranded inside it. If a political alliance fails today, contracts are voided, partnerships dissolve, people move on. Back then, lives were voided instead.
Now let's talk about the most dangerous thing a noble woman could be. Not disloyal, not scandalous, simply related to the throne when succession was uncertain. European inheritance law was built on a simple premise. Bloodlines must be clear, continuity must be absolute, and doubt must be eliminated. The moment a crown passed from one head to another, every legal claim, every distant cousin, every potential challenger became a calculation. And women, especially women with royal blood, were always part of that math. Here's how it worked. A king dies, his son inherits, but the son is young or sickly or unmarried or his own claim is contested. Maybe he's a second son who wasn't supposed to rule. Maybe his legitimacy depends on a previous marriage that powerful nobles never fully accepted. The throne is vulnerable, and in that vulnerability, female relatives stop being family. They become variables in an equation that only has one acceptable answer: survival of the current line. Because the heir was fragile, his half-sister, daughter of a previous queen, suddenly represented an alternative claim. Because legitimacy was questioned, his aunt, married into a rival noble house, became a bridge to challengers. Because the dynasty panicked, his own wife, if she hadn't produced a son, turned into a liability that could be replaced. The transformation was legal before it was violent. Inheritance law in medieval and early modern Europe was deliberately flexible when it needed to be. Salic law in France barred women from the throne entirely, but other kingdoms allowed succession through the female line under specific conditions. That ambiguity was useful. It meant that when succession anxiety peaked, lawmakers could reinterpret old statutes, discover convenient precedents, or simply declare that certain bloodlines no longer counted. A woman's claim could be voided because her mother's marriage was retroactively annulled, because her legitimacy rested on documents that suddenly couldn't be found, because a church court, pressured by the crown, ruled that her birth violated canon law in ways no one had mentioned for 20 years. Watch what happens next. The legal groundwork laid, accusations would follow. Not random accusations, calculated ones. A noble woman with a claim to the throne might be accused of plotting to poison the heir. Evidence? Testimony from servants who'd been promised their freedom, letters that appeared convenient, witnesses who recanted later when it no longer mattered. Or the accusation would be moral. Adultery was particularly effective because it destroyed both the woman and any children she'd borne. If her sons could be declared illegitimate, they couldn't challenge the throne. If her reputation was shattered publicly, her noble supporters would abandon her to protect themselves. The accusation didn't need to be proven beyond doubt. It just needed to be loud enough and official enough that opposing it became politically dangerous. Some women were never formally accused of anything. They simply disappeared from records. A sister who'd been mentioned in court documents for years would stop appearing. No death recorded, no marriage announced, no convent named, just absence where a person used to be. Historians today find these gaps and can only speculate. House arrest in a remote castle? Forced into a tower with minimal staff? Killed quietly and the death concealed? The structure of power made this possible because succession crises created permission. When the throne itself was at risk, laws bent, morality became flexible. Blood ties, which were supposed to be sacred, became irrelevant compared to dynastic stability. Here's the pattern worth noticing. It wasn't one tyrant. It wasn't a single brutal king.
It was dozens of successions, across centuries, across kingdoms, where the same logic applied. France, England, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, different laws, different cultures, same outcome. When the heir was vulnerable, women with claims were removed, legally if possible, extra-legally if necessary. Because fear doesn't need a villain. Fear just needs a system that prioritizes survival over everything else. And in that system, a noblewoman's royal blood, the very thing that should have protected her, became the reason she had to be erased. The throne didn't see sisters or wives or cousins. It saw threats dressed in genealogy, and it responded accordingly.
Here's something they understood better than we do. Reputation wasn't personal, it was infrastructure. A dynasty's legitimacy rested on the perceived virtue of its women as much as the military strength of its men. Which meant that when a throne faced instability, when nobles grew restless or the populace questioned royal authority, the fastest way to restore order was to publicly prove the crown still controlled morality itself. And that required a sacrifice, not in private, not quietly, publicly, loudly, with enough ceremony that everyone from the court to the countryside knew judgment had been passed and order restored. Let's look at how this actually worked. A crisis emerges, maybe a military defeat that weakened the king's authority, maybe a succession dispute that divided the nobility, maybe economic collapse that had commoners questioning why they should starve for a crown that couldn't protect them. The throne needs to demonstrate control. It needs to show that chaos has a source, and that source is being eliminated. Enter the scandal. Adultery was the preferred charge because it carried multiple uses. It destroyed the woman, it nullified any children she'd borne, clearing succession complications, and crucially, it transformed political instability into a moral problem with a simple solution. The kingdom wasn't failing because of bad leadership or impossible wars. It was suffering because sin had infected the royal house. Remove the sin, restore the order. Watch how the accusation unfolds. It doesn't start with evidence, it starts with announcement. A noblewoman, often a queen or high-ranking duchess, is suddenly confined to her chambers. Before any trial, before any formal charges, the court already knows. Servants gossip, ambassadors send urgent letters home. The scandal spreads precisely because it was designed to spread. Then comes the performance, a trial, but not the kind meant to discover truth. This is theater. The proceedings are public or semi-public. Nobles are required to attend. The accusations are read aloud with detail graphic enough to shock, specific enough to sound credible, but vague enough that disproving them is nearly impossible. She was seen entering a chamber alone with a man. She exchanged letters of suspicious intimacy. She bore a child that doesn't resemble her husband. The evidence arrives pre-packaged. Servants testify, and their testimony is remarkably consistent because they've been coached or coerced or promised leniency for their own fabricated crimes. Letters appear that conveniently confirm the worst suspicions. Sometimes the letters are real, stripped of context. Sometimes they're simply forged. It doesn't matter. By the time they're read in court, the audience has already decided. Here's the gap worth noticing. In private, doubt existed. Nobles who knew the accused woman personally questioned the charges. Ambassadors wrote home expressing skepticism about the evidence. Court insiders whispered that the timing was suspiciously convenient, that the king had been seeking an annulment for years, that the scandal emerged exactly when a new alliance required the queen's removal. But publicly, certainty, absolute, unquestionable certainty. The pronouncements were declarative. Guilt was stated as fact. The church, when involved, spoke with moral authority that left no room for appeal, and the punishment was announced as both justice and necessity. Execution, exile, annulment, confinement to a convent. The sentence was always severe enough to prove the crown's commitment to virtue.
The brilliance of this, from a purely strategic standpoint, was that it redirected blame entirely. The failed war, the succession crisis, the economic suffering, none of that was the dynasty's fault anymore. It was her fault. Her immorality had brought divine punishment on the kingdom. Her removal would restore favor. The crowd, desperate for someone to blame, accepted this logic because the alternative was acknowledging that their rulers were simply failing. And the scandal did something else. It warned every other noblewoman in every other court exactly what could happen if they became inconvenient. Your reputation, no matter how carefully maintained, could be destroyed in a matter of weeks if the throne needed it destroyed. Your protestations of innocence would be irrelevant against coordinated testimony. Your allies would abandon you because supporting you meant opposing the crown's version of morality itself. Some women were guilty of what they were accused of, certainly, but guilt was almost beside the point. The function of the scandal was political stabilization, and it worked whether the accusations were true or manufactured. The outcome was identical either way: a woman publicly destroyed, a dynasty publicly cleansed, and everyone else reminded that the crown controlled not just laws, but truth itself. History often remembers the accusation, the adulterous queen, the immoral duchess, the fallen noblewoman. What history forgets is who benefited from her fall, which succession was clarified, which alliance became possible, which rival noble house lost influence when their female connection to the throne was severed. The scandal was never about her. It was about what her destruction accomplished, and it accomplished exactly what it was designed to.
There was a solution more elegant than execution, cleaner than scandal, and infinitely more permanent than exile: the convent. On the surface, it looked like mercy. A noble woman taking religious vows, dedicating her life to God, withdrawing from the corruptions of worldly power. The church praised it. Chronicles recorded it as evidence of piety, and the woman herself disappeared from political life completely, which was exactly the point. But here's what the historical record actually shows when you look closely. The vows weren't chosen, they were imposed. The mechanics worked like this. A noblewoman became inconvenient. Maybe she had a claim to an inheritance her family wanted to pass to a son. Maybe her marriage needed to be dissolved, but annulment was legally complicated. Maybe she knew too much about court dealings that a new regime wanted buried. The solution was to make her vanish in a way that looked holy. She would be informed, often by male relatives or royal advisors, that she had a calling, that God was drawing her towards spiritual life, that her family had arranged for her to enter a specific convent, sometimes one they'd just endowed with a generous donation. The language was always religious, but the structure underneath was pure coercion. Because here's the detail that matters. In medieval and early modern Europe, once a woman took religious vows, she ceased to exist in civil law. She couldn't inherit property, she couldn't marry, she couldn't testify in secular courts, she couldn't leave the convent without permission from church authorities, who were often the same people who'd arranged her confinement. Legally, she was dead to the world, which made her perfect for problems that required someone to stop existing without the inconvenience of actual death. The process had variations. Sometimes the noblewoman was young, barely adolescent when she was sent to a convent and told she would stay there. She might believe initially that this was temporary, that her family would retrieve her. Years would pass. The vows, once provisional, would become permanent. By the time she understood what had happened, she was legally bound. Other times, the woman was older, aware of exactly what was being done to her, and forced anyway. The pressure came from all directions. Her father or brother would explain that the family's honor required it, that a scandal was brewing and only her removal could prevent disaster. Church officials would visit, speaking of divine will and spiritual duty. If she resisted, the threats would become explicit: enter the convent voluntarily or be accused of crimes that would lead to worse consequences. Some women were physically escorted to convents with armed guards. The official record would state they went willingly,
that they'd embraced their vocation with joy. The reality was confinement dressed in religious language. Once inside, the convent became a very specific type of prison, not violent, not even officially punitive, just isolated. Letters could be monitored or confiscated. Visitors required permission from the abbess, who often owed her position to the very family that had sent the noblewoman there. The daily structure of prayer, labor, and silence meant that even if the woman wanted to communicate with the outside world, opportunities were scarce and controlled. And here's the twisted efficiency of it. Because the confinement was religious, it was unchallengeable. Questioning a woman's vows meant questioning the church's authority. Suggesting she'd been forced meant accusing noble families of impiety. The moral framework that surrounded monastic life created a shield that made it nearly impossible for anyone to intervene, even if they suspected coercion. The silence was institutional. Convents operated under rules that limited speech. Some orders required near total silence except during designated hours. A noblewoman could spend decades behind those walls, and the world outside would have no idea whether she'd accepted her fate or was desperately waiting for rescue that would never come. Political rivals disappeared this way. Witnesses to inconvenient truths disappeared this way. Women whose very existence complicated inheritance disappeared this way. And because their disappearance was framed as holy devotion, it was celebrated rather than investigated. The historical documents that survive are telling in their emptiness. A noblewoman would be mentioned in court records for years. Then an entry, she has taken vows at such and such convent. And then, nothing. No letters, no further mention. Just a name that stops appearing, a life that stops mattering to anyone keeping records. What makes this particularly insidious is that some women genuinely did choose religious life. Convents offered education, community, and escape from forced marriages. But that authentic choice provided cover for the forced ones. The existence of willing nuns made it easier to pretend all nuns were willing. The dynasties understood this perfectly. Religion offered moral justification for removal. The church provided the infrastructure for confinement, and the woman, once inside, became someone who had chosen holiness over worldly ambition. The narrative wrote itself. No bloodshed, no scandal, no trial. Just a woman who was there one day and gone the next. Her absence explained by piety instead of politics. The question worth asking is simple. Where does faith end and force begin? When a noblewoman took vows because her family demanded it, because her freedom was contingent on compliance, because refusal meant accusation or worse, was that devotion or elimination? The historical record calls it the former, but the structure underneath reveals the latter.
Sometimes a woman couldn't be hidden away. Sometimes she knew too much, claimed too much, or represented a threat so persistent that distance wasn't enough. And sometimes the solution was simpler than any legal maneuvering or religious performance. Death. But not announced, not dramatic, just documented. A line in a chronicle, a brief mention in official correspondence, then silence. Here's what the official records say. A noblewoman dies of sudden illness, fever perhaps, or complications from childbirth, or she simply grew weak and passed in her sleep. The death is noted. The burial is recorded, sometimes in detail, sometimes not, and the matter is closed. Here's what the official records don't say. The illness came remarkably fast, often within days of a political shift that made her presence inconvenient. The childbirth complications occurred when her husband needed to remarry for a new alliance. The weakness appeared just as her claim to an inheritance was about to be legally contested. The timing was never questioned in writing, but the timing was always the tell. Medieval and early modern death records are strange documents when you study them closely. They report facts with confidence, but rarely with detail. A queen dies suddenly at age 28. The cause is listed as natural. What constituted natural? Who examined the body? Who verified the diagnosis? These questions don't appear because asking them would suggest doubt, and doubt would suggest something worth hiding. Some deaths were legally sanctioned, execution, but framed as justice. A noblewoman accused of treason or adultery or conspiracy would face trial, conviction, and sentencing. The execution itself might be public or private, depending on what served the dynasty better. Public executions demonstrated the crown's power and willingness to punish even the highest born. Private executions avoided creating a spectacle that might generate sympathy or inspire opposition. But the legal executions, for all their cruelty, were at least visible. The deaths that haunt the historical record are the ones that happened quietly. The noblewoman who was imprisoned in a remote castle and died months later of unspecified causes. The sister of a king who fell ill during house arrest and never recovered. The duchess whose death was announced weeks after it supposedly occurred, with no witnesses named and no details provided. Poison was suspected in many cases, but provable in almost none. Medical knowledge was limited enough that sudden death from illness was common and accepted, which meant that poison, if used skillfully, was nearly undetectable. A woman could be healthy one week and dead the next, and the official explanation would be fever or weakness or divine will. Autopsies were rare and conducted only when political necessity demanded them, which meant that when a death was convenient for the crown, no one looked too closely. There are patterns in how these deaths cluster. A succession crisis begins, multiple claimants to a throne or title. Then, over the following months or years, the female claimants start dying. Not all at once, that would be too obvious, but steadily. One dies in childbirth, another succumbs to illness, a third is executed after a convenient accusation, and when the dust settles, the male heir's path is clear. The historical records treat each death as separate, unconnected events, but the pattern is unmistakable when you map them chronologically. The women who posed threats died at rates statistically improbable unless something other than chance was involved. Some deaths weren't even hidden, they were justified. Legal documents would explain that the woman had committed crimes so severe that execution was necessary for the safety of the realm. The trial records would be preserved, showing her guilt beyond question. Except when modern historians examine those records, the evidence falls apart. Testimony from coerced witnesses, confessions obtained under torture or threat, accusations that served a political purpose too perfectly to be coincidental. The execution would be carried out, the dynasty would move on, and history would record that justice was served. Here's what's particularly chilling. Some women simply vanish from records entirely before their death is ever mentioned. A noblewoman appears in documents regularly, then stops appearing. Years later, a single line in a chronicle mentions she died long ago. When? Where? How? The record doesn't say. She existed, then she didn't, and the gap between those two states contains no information at all. Historians call these gaps frustrating. They're more than that. They're erasures, the deliberate removal of someone from history because their death or the circumstances around it couldn't be explained in a way that protected those responsible. And sometimes the death was recorded, but the body wasn't buried where the records claim. Tombs that supposedly hold noblewomen are opened centuries later and found empty, or they contain remains that don't match the age or sex of the person supposedly interred there. The official story says she was buried with honor. The physical evidence says something else entirely. The function of these deaths was closure. A problem existed, the problem was removed. The documentation was minimal enough to avoid scrutiny, but official enough to prevent questions, and the dynasty continued, unburdened by the woman who'd been in the way. No dramatics required, no elaborate conspiracies, just a system that understood death could be administrative, a task completed, a file closed, a name that stops appearing in records because the person behind it no longer existed to cause complications. The official story was always tidy: illness, childbirth, accident, execution for proven crimes. History accepted these explanations because questioning them meant accusing powerful families of murder, and evidence was conveniently absent. But the absences themselves tell the story. The deaths that came too quickly, the illnesses with no symptoms recorded before they turned fatal, the executions based on evidence that doesn't hold up under examination. the women who simply stopped existing in records with no death ever officially noted. Silence doesn't prove murder, but it reveals that something was worth keeping quiet. And when the pattern repeats across dynasties, across centuries, across kingdoms with different laws and customs, the explanation becomes clear. Death wasn't a rare solution, it was a reliable one. Quiet, efficient, final, and, almost always, officially explained as something else entirely.
So let's step back from the individual stories and look at what connected them all. This wasn't about cruel kings or evil families, though those certainly existed. This was about a system, a structure that predated any individual ruler and would outlast them all. European dynasties were machines built for one purpose: continuation. Everything else was negotiable. And noblewomen were part of the machinery. They were born into families that measured their value in alliances they could secure, heirs they could produce, claims they could strengthen, or threats they could pose. Their blood made them useful. That same blood made them expendable. The system didn't see the contradiction because there wasn't one. Use and disposal were just different stages of the same process. Think about what survival actually meant for these dynasties. Not the survival of people, the survival of the institution, the crown, the title, the territorial control. The lineage itself, abstract and immortal, mattered more than any individual within it. A king could die, his daughter could be sacrificed, his sister could disappear, but the dynasty would continue, and that continuation justified whatever had to be done. This logic repeated across centuries because it worked. France, England, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, the Italian states, the Iberian kingdoms, different languages, different laws, different cultures, but the same fundamental calculus. When power was threatened, women with royal blood became problems to solve, and the solutions were remarkably consistent. Failed alliances? Abandon the woman and rewrite the narrative to blame her. Succession crises? Remove female claimants through legal manipulation, forced vows, or quiet death. Scandals threatening stability? Sacrifice a noblewoman publicly to restore the appearance of moral order. Inconvenient knowledge or claims? Confine her to a convent where she'd cease to exist in any political sense. Persistent threats? Handle it permanently and document it as natural, legal, or divinely ordained. The pattern wasn't accidental, it was structural. These weren't isolated incidents of cruelty, they were systemic responses to systemic pressures. The dynasty faced a problem, the system offered solutions, and those solutions overwhelmingly targeted the women who, by accident of birth, had become obstacles to institutional survival. Here's what makes this particularly worth understanding. We look back at these periods and see individual tragedies: a queen executed, a princess forced into a convent, a noblewoman who died under suspicious circumstances, and we frame these as moral failures of specific people. That king was a monster, that family was ruthless, that court was corrupt. But the system didn't need monsters. It ran perfectly well with ordinary people making rational decisions within the incentive structures that surrounded them. A father who sent his daughter into a dangerous marriage wasn't necessarily evil, he was managing an alliance his kingdom needed. A brother who supported his sister's confinement to a convent wasn't necessarily heartless, he was clearing a succession dispute that threatened civil war. A council that approved a noblewoman's execution wasn't necessarily bloodthirsty, they were eliminating what they genuinely believed was a threat to stability. The machinery didn't require exceptional cruelty, it just required people to prioritize institutional survival over individual lives. And in a world where dynasties were the primary structure of political organization, where the collapse of a ruling house could mean war, famine, and chaos for thousands, that prioritization seemed not just logical, but necessary. Which brings us to the question underneath all of this. What did these dynasties actually preserve? They survived, yes, some for centuries, But what was the cost of that survival? Not just to the women sacrificed, but to the societies that normalized their sacrifice. Because here's what the historical record shows. The dynasties that were most willing to sacrifice their noblewomen weren't necessarily the most stable. The ones that engineered scandals and executions and forced confinements often faced the very succession crises and legitimacy problems they were trying to prevent. The machinery designed to ensure continuation sometimes accelerated collapse instead. But by then, the women were already gone. Their deaths or disappearances already documented, their stories already edited into acceptable narratives or erased entirely. And history moved on, celebrating the crowns that survived while rarely counting what survival cost. We remember the dynasties, we study the kings, we map the territories and treaties, but how many of the women do we remember? Not the queens who happened to matter politically, not the ones who became regents or wielded influence despite the system. The others, the ones who were useful until they weren't, the ones who were sacrificed so a title could pass cleanly, or an alliance could shift, or a scandal could be contained. Most of their names are forgotten, and that forgetting was part of the design. So here's what I want you to consider. When we talk about the great European dynasties, about their achievements and their legacy, we're talking about institutions that functioned by treating some human lives as expendable, not as exceptions, as standard operating procedure. And we've inherited histories written by and for those institutions, histories that frame sacrifice as necessity and erasure as inevitability. But it wasn't inevitable, it was chosen, over and over, for centuries. The cost of crowns wasn't paid by the people wearing them. It was paid by the people born into proximity to them, whose value was always conditional and whose disposal was always justifiable when the institution demanded it. That's the pattern. That's the system. That's what we're looking at when we look at European dynastic history honestly. Not a collection of tragedies, a machine that ran on them. Which sacrifice do you think history justified too easily?